Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Lucy Tassell.
Earlier this week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called Israel's blockade of food and aid supplies into Gaza outrageous. His comments came as Australia joined 22 other nations in demanding Israel allow the full resumption of humanitarian aid to Gaza's 2.1 million residents. Today, we're going to break down what's happening with aid delivery to Gaza, look at how the international community has responded, and discuss Australia's position on the issue.
Emma, I don't think there would be anyone listening to this who isn't aware of kind of the broad brushstrokes of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza, but there definitely have been a lot of headlines specifically around the flow of aid into Gaza and how that's been controlled in recent days. Before we get into what the Prime Minister said, kind of that most recent headline, can you give me some context about what's been happening in terms of aid getting into Gaza?
Yeah, so this all stems back to the ceasefire deal that was agreed between Hamas and Israel back in January. Now, you might recall that ceasefire was meant to have 3 phases.
Yeah.
And the first phase required Hamas to release 33 hostages over a 6-week period. That included releasing women, children, the elderly, the bodies of hostages who were killed in captivity, and in exchange, Israel would release hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. Phase 1 ended on the 1st of March, and the US did propose extending that phase, which would have seen all remaining hostages released by around mid-April, with approximately 58 hostages still estimated to be held in Gaza, many of whom, though, are presumed dead.
Yes.
Hamas rejected the terms of that agreement, and negotiations for the remaining phases have been ongoing for months. So phase 1 of 3 went ahead, and then we haven't had any progress really on a ceasefire deal in the months since.
Yeah.
Since that ceasefire agreement ended, Israel has blocked aid from reaching Gaza. It says that this is about pressuring Hamas to release the remaining hostages who are still being held, but it is a story that has gained international attention, particularly over recent weeks, for the length that aid blockage continued for.
Yeah, I mean, the UN has made a lot of comments about the conditions in Gaza even before that blockade began. Can you kind of give me a sense of what has happened in the last couple of months?
Yeah, so the World Health Organization says that the entire population of Gaza, that's 2.1 million people, is now facing prolonged food shortages. So nearly 500,000 people are in what they've called a catastrophic situation of hunger, acute malnutrition, starvation, illness, and death. The WHO has said that while officially, quote, famine has not yet been declared, it has said people are starving now and that 3/4 of Gaza's population are at emergency or catastrophic levels of food deprivation. Earlier this month, we also heard the WHO say that since this aid blockage began in March, 57 children have reportedly died from the effects of malnutrition. The UN has labelled Israel's decision to block aid as, quote, cruel collective punishment of Palestinians, and said that aid should never be a bargaining chip.
So this blockade has been in place since March, and then last week Israel announced it would allow some aid to enter Gaza. What happened there?
Yeah, so last week we heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who announced that some aid would be allowed to enter Gaza. And his office said that Israel was allowing the entry of, quote, a basic amount of food for the population in order to prevent the development of a famine crisis in the Gaza Strip. So that announcement followed mounting pressure from the international community. And 3 days later, the UN reported that 90 lorry loads, so 90 truckloads worth of humanitarian aid, had entered Gaza. Now, that delivery included flour, baby food, medical equipment, those basic necessities for everyday life in Gaza, where, as you've mentioned, we know conditions were already extreme. A day later, so after those 90 truckloads, another 100 trucks entered Gaza, and the UN welcomed this move, but it's described the deliveries so far as nowhere near enough to meet the vast needs in Gaza.
How has the international community responded to that?
So there have been 2 separate joint statements of note that I'll take you through, issued by some of Israel's closest allies, interestingly. Now, in one, we heard from the leaders of Canada, France and the UK call the level of human suffering in Gaza intolerable. They said Israel's decision to allow a, quote, basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly inadequate. In this statement, they called for the restoration of aid by Israel and the release of hostages by Hamas. It is probably the most strongly worded language that we've seen from these leaders since the war began.
Yeah.
They said if Israel does not cease its renewed military offensive and lift its restrictions on humanitarian aid in the region, quote, we will take further concrete actions in response.
Yeah,
so some
wow.
really strong language there.
Yeah.
In response, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, quote, I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. By way of an update on all of this, though, we have since seen those concrete steps that were alluded to in the statement from France, the UK and Canada begin to be taken. So the UK has suspended trade talks with Israel as its direct action or response against the aid blockage. And the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy called Israel's blockade incompatible with the principles that underpin the UK-Israeli bilateral relationship.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm the co-founder of the Daily Aus, and we started this company because we think news can be done differently. If you agree, you can hit subscribe. It's the best way to help us grow. Now, back to the video.
Obviously, we've heard from the Prime Minister. He's not the only person who can kind of speak on behalf of Australia. What have we heard from other Australian authorities?
So last week, Australia actually joined with 22 other nations, including Canada, France, Germany, the UK, to issue a joint statement. And essentially this statement has called on Israel to allow the full resumption of aid into Gaza.
Yeah.
This statement has come on the other side of those 190 truckloads entering, this kind of feedback from the global aid community that doesn't go far enough. And the statement said, quote, food, medicines and essential supplies are exhausted. The population faces starvation. Gaza's people must receive the aid they desperately need. It also said that humanitarian aid should never be politicized. This is a message that we've heard time and time again from the United Nations, and that UN and humanitarian NGOs must be responsible for delivering this aid. That's a point that we're going to touch on a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I did want to just quickly give you a bit more on what Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said individually when he was asked about the situation in Gaza. Here's a little bit of what he said.
Israel's actions are completely unacceptable. It is outrageous that there be a blockade of food and supplies to people who are in need in Gaza.
Now, at the time of recording, it's worth mentioning Australia has not taken any concrete steps or action against Israel like what we've seen with the trade talks being suspended between Israel and the UK. But we did hear one Labor member, Ed Husick, who was recently dumped from the front bench. You might have heard his name in the news lately in terms of that parliamentary reshuffle. But he has called on his party to take further action. So Husick wrote in an opinion piece for The Guardian that his government should be firstly calling in the Israeli ambassador to Australia to express the, quote, unequivocal demand we share that the Israeli government must provide more aid. And he also suggested that Australia should increase its financial contribution to aid in Gaza. Now, so far, we haven't heard Anthony Albanese commit to those steps, but we do know, at least from Husick's part, that there is some agitation within the Labor Party.
Australia's foreign policy is often guided by what the US does. What have we heard from them? I mean, given also that the US is a staunch ally of Israel.
Yeah, so this kind of ties back into this pressure about who is responsible for aid and calls for the UN and humanitarian NGOs to be the ones who lead that aid, because we've seen a bit of controversy while this global pressure has been mounting around a US-backed Gaza aid program.
Okay.
It's called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. This is an NGO, but it does have the support of American and Israeli officials. Now, both governments want aid distribution responsibilities to be transferred to the GHF from the United Nations. So this foundation would, under this plan, be responsible for the delivery and rollout of aid in Gaza.
What has the United Nations said about that?
Well, the UN has many concerns with this proposal. I'll run through a few of the most talked about ones right now. The concerns are around the GHF restricting who can access food. So under this plan, aid would be centralised to 4 distribution sites. Those GHF sites would be secured by private military contractors. Now, Israel has been accused of being deliberately vague about how the operation would work specifically in Gaza, and there are fears that residents would have to travel potentially really far and wide to access any aid, and with so much of the population at risk of famine, with other shortages to healthcare and medication access.
Petrol to fuel cars to get distances.
So there are many concerns about who will actually be able to get aid if it's centralised to those 4 spots. And humanitarian groups have also flagged privacy concerns. They say that aid recipients will have to consent to biometric surveillance with facial recognition technology being implemented to access aid. So concerns around, security, the private military contractors. Roundly, this plan has been condemned by the United Nations strongly.
Well, given that response, do we think it's actually going to go ahead, and do we know when that might happen?
There is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this rollout. We've seen that uncertainty kind of intensify this week with the CEO of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation actually resigning.
Oh, wow.
His name is Jake Wood, and he announced he was stepping back over concerns around the GHF's independence. He claims that under the current plan, it would not be able to deliver aid in Gaza without breaching, these are his words, the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, which I will not abandon, Wood said in a statement. The GHF board said that it is disappointed that Wood has decided to resign, but it's reiterated that the organisation is committed to delivering aid in Gaza. The US State Department has also maintained its support for the GHF, so some significant support there. It doesn't seem to be going away. Some key players who aren't backing down, and will continue monitoring the situation.
Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down for us, Emma. And as you mentioned, we'll certainly continue following this story as it develops.
Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Aus. We will be back a little bit later on today with your evening headlines. But until then, have a great day.